What happened at the 2025 Imola Grand Prix? What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. We're here to talk about what happened over the course of the weekend in Italy for the first time as F1 begins their European leg of the season. It starts in Imola, and it was a bit of an interesting weekend from the jump. It got very interesting in qualifying, and it all wrapped up with a pretty spicy race in some degrees, but ultimately it ended up being Max Verstappen to take the win. We're going to go over our weekend quick hits, our weekend winners and losers, and then we'll wrap things up by going over the predictions that we made before the weekend began. And then we'll see where F1 goes next. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump on into it with our quick hits. Where else can you start the quick hits than the winner of the Imola Grand Prix? It is Max Verstappen. It is Red Bull who brought a bit of upgrades this weekend and really seemed to finally put a decent car under Max Verstappen, who not only was able to qualify very well on the front row, but also challenge Oscar Piastri, the pole sitter, at the jump and put in probably one of the most impressive moves into turn one I think I can remember ever seeing, going around the outside of turn one, which then of course turns into the inside of turn two, and was a brilliant move, late on the brakes, a daring move to say the least, and he gets it done and is able to utilize that clear air and drive off into the distance, not only keeping the McLarens at bay, but actually pulling an even larger gap as the McLarens dealt with their own problems and tire wear on their own. So Red Bull back, question mark? Things might start heating up, and it's going to get very interesting from here if Red Bull are finally starting to get their heads under their car. Next up, we have to obviously talk about McLaren, a bit more, business as usual. Oscar Piastri taking pole this weekend, ultimately losing out, and unfortunately just getting on the wrong end of a strategy call from McLaren, boxing into a lot of traffic, and Oscar had to use a lot of time and energy fighting back through the field, unlike Lando Norris and Max Verstappen, which were able to utilize the clear air at the front and kind of taking the fact that there was no gap to pit into to their own advantage, as it turns out, with some safety cars and virtual safety cars that would come later. Oscar obviously charged back through the field very efficiently, but at the same time, it really put him on the back foot when it came to being on the right tire at the right time, ultimately kind of finishing behind Lando and Max based on that. But the final safety car, him having to pit, trying to get back on the right strategy again. And ultimately P3, based on all of that, was probably about as much as he could have done. Lando Norris, on the other hand, had another very interesting situation. It seems like we happen to see it all the time with Lando, where he was really struggling to get by slower traffic and ultimately came home to finish P2 in this one. But at the same time, with the pace that Max and Red Bull had over the course of the weekend, I'm not sure if much more was really on the cards. It didn't seem like McLaren was really far and away the best of the best here this weekend. So this championship is far from over, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing how it plays out. Let's talk about the hometown team, Ferrari. A bit of a shocker on Saturday as both drivers are knocked out in Q2, both finishing in 11th and 12th, I believe. Charles Leclerc in 11th and Lewis Hamilton in 12th. This was a bit of a shock, as we really were expecting probably to see more from Ferrari going into the weekend. I think a lot of people really started to question them after that result, but they were able to actually utilize a lot of really good strategy calls and good race pace and finish pretty well into the top 10, and probably better at or above where you would kind of expected them to at the beginning of the weekend. So they really bounced back after a poor qualifying on Saturday, but man, they really need to start getting on the weekend from the jump if they're really going to want to challenge at all, because some teams behind them are slowly starting to push up. Quite like Williams and Alex Albon, who might actually just be the GOAT now, has another top 5 finish on the cards for him this season in the Williams. Him and Carlos Sainz looked pretty decent in terms of pace this weekend. Carlos unfortunately did not get as lucky as Alex did. Alex put himself once again in brilliant position and bagged another top 5 finish for him and the team. Williams is very much looking like they could potentially be challenging Ferrari for P4 in the Constructors by the time the season is over, if Ferrari can't get their stuff figured out. Not a whole lot much more to talk about. We will talk about Aston Martin. Brought a big load of upgrades this weekend to try and push themselves back towards, at least challenging in the midfield where you would expect them to. We thought we were going to see a huge jump forward for them when they managed to qualify both cars into Q3, and Fernando Alonso even finished starting in the top 5, but alas, it just wasn't meant to be. And so it really just feels like As Aston learns, they'll probably be able to unlock more performance out of the car, but at this weekend, it was probably a bit disappointing to see them start as high as they did, and then also walk away with no points. Let's talk about Yuki Tsunoda now. Obviously a very, very up and down weekend for him. Obviously his really big crash at the beginning of Q1, which saw him into the catch fencing, spinning. Thankfully, he was able to walk away from that one unharmed. He ultimately ended up starting the race in the pit lane, but ultimately battled all the way back up to finish P10. And I know before the weekend started, we talked about in our predictions how Yuki finishing P10 wasn't always going to be the best look in the world, but at the same time, when you can battle around a track like Imola and finish in the points from the pit lane, you have to give your flowers for that. So Yuki, what a bounce back from a big crash on Saturday. Good job. And then our last point, it's something I don't think we've seen too much recently over the last couple of years, is a couple of reliability DNFs, as well as a reliability, presumably P19 or P18 at that point for Ollie Behrman. We saw both Esteban Ocon and Kimi Antonelli retire from the race thanks to some reliability issues. We aren't sure exactly what went wrong for both drivers, but ultimately both of them pulled off the track effectively at the exact same location, ultimately DNFing from this one. Esteban Ocon sounded like he had an air processing issue, maybe the engine overheating, developing a problem. Kimi, I didn't see anything at all after the race, at least not that I had seen so far, so it might just become something kind of similar, maybe a bit of an air limitation, engine cooling problem, maybe just a component here or there might have just given up, and unfortunately they had to retire. We also saw Ollie Behrman pit very late in the race. They speculated that it could have been similar to the Esteban Ocon issue, but ultimately, Ollie ended up making his way back out onto the track and ultimately gathering some more data for the team. So unsure what exactly went on there, but at the same time, when was the last time we saw multiple cars DNF thanks to reliability? Just something to think about. All right, we're going to quickly move along to our weekend winners and losers. This is going to be relatively short because we kind of already mentioned both my winner and loser for the weekend. We'll begin with our weekend winner, and I'm actually going to go with Ferrari on this one. Ultimately, I think they could not have been more disappointed than be both drivers knocked out in Q2 over qualifying. But ultimately, they made up for it by being very decisive and quick in the race. Their race pace looked above average compared to what you would expected to see them so far this season. And ultimately, they made the right strategy calls to really take advantage of the virtual safety car and safety car, as well as splitting strategies between Leclerc and Hamilton to really push them up the order in this one. And ultimately, I think it ended up working out very, very well. You had Hamilton end up finishing P4, and Charles Leclerc ended up P6 just behind Alex Albon. So a P4 and a P6 after qualifying 11th and 12th must be pretty good. I don't think anyone would be looking at that too disappointedly in terms of their actual finishing position. Of course, I'm sure they would much rather be starting in those positions and moving forward, but at the same time, it was a good bounce back. And without choosing Alex again, which I think deserves a special shout out, I think Ferrari deserves the nod on this one. If we can clown them for when they make mistakes, I think we need to applaud them for when they finally turn things around. All right, quickly on to our weekend loser, and I'm going with Aston Martin in this one. I think what we saw, kind of basically the exact opposite of Ferrari, which I feel like made this decision really easy. We saw Aston bring some upgrades, look relatively quick. Fernando Alonso qualifies P5, Lance Stroll also in the top 10 in qualifying. They look very, very poised to finally bring home some points. Fernando looking to bring home his first points here in 2025. But ultimately, as the race went on, you saw them slowly and methodically just kind of start moving their way back down through the field. Ultimately, Fernando ended up finishing just outside the points, and Lance kind of off in no man's land down towards the end of the grid. And so it must be a very disappointing weekend for Aston, especially following with qualifying. That must have been thrilling to them in the moment. Must be pretty disheartening to see the drivers just fall down the order. We even saw some exclamations from Fernando Alonso declaring himself the unluckiest driver on the grid, maybe even in history. And it's hard to really disagree with him too much on this one. It was a very, very long day for Aston, I'm sure, and I'd be interested to see what they can do going forward with these upgrades. It showed seemingly that they gained some pace, but is it qualifying pace or is it race pace? Because one certainly looks good on paper, but it makes the other one very, very hard. We'll see. All right, let's go ahead and move on to our predictions results. These are what happened with our predictions that we made leading up into the Grand Prix weekend. Let's go ahead and begin with my pick for biggest positive surprise. And I thought I was absolutely cooking with this one. I ended up going with Carlos Sainz, who feels like he's been on the cusp of a breakthrough weekend for a long time now, and I thought coming off of a week break heading back to Imola, I think we would have seen something very exciting happen. I really thought this one was coming in because Carlos ends up out qualifying Alex and runs very, very well over the course of the beginning stretch of the race, but ultimately just could not, for whatever reason, just get into the right flow state of this race, and ultimately ended up finishing in the points, but well down the order. And when you have your teammate finishing P5 on the road, I think it's pretty tough to say that you are the biggest positive surprise. I definitely included that he would be beating Alex, which looked like it might have been on the cards, but ultimately Alex delivered and Carlos didn't. Whether that's his fault or not, unfortunately I cannot give myself the point on this one. As we move on now to my pick for biggest disappointment, and this one I will go ahead and start out with it, is I'm getting a half point for this one because I went with Yuki Tsunoda. Crashing out on your first qualifying lap in Q1 is extremely disappointing. Not only that, well, thankfully he did walk away. It was a massive, massive, massive shunt into the catch fence before ultimately rolling back over into the gravel trap. And thankfully he walked away, but that is a big, big off. And a start from the pit lane, I think, should probably in most instances resulted in a biggest disappointment lock, but ultimately Yuki, like I said, finished back up in P10, and so I'm giving myself a bit of a half point here because it was very disappointing to see him crash like he did in Q1, but at the same time he battled back. So we got the go ahead from the community. Half point for me on this one. As we move on now to my qualifying predictions, I predicted a Lando Norris pole, a Max Verstappen P2, and an Oscar Piastri P3. Ultimately in this one, Oscar obviously ended up taking pole position. Max I did get correct there in P2, but ultimately it was not Lando Norris in P3. So ultimately over the course of the qualifying predictions, 1.5 points for me, and I will take that every day of the week because at this point, I think I might officially be done making Lando predictions for pole, just because it really just feels like as of right now, he just doesn't have what it takes to really get the maximum out of the car when it matters the most. So I think the car is definitely fast enough to have him qualify in the top 3 or 4. But ultimately, I don't know if he has what it takes right now to qualify on pole. So I think I might be taking a break from Lando pole position. So we'll see. As we move on now to my race podium, I went with a Lando Norris win, an Oscar Piastri P2, and then I went with a George Russell P3 in this one. It felt like a weekend where it would have been prime. George Russell just sneaks into P3 for some reason, and ultimately it might have come in as the qualifying wrapped up, but ultimately in this one, I think the race pace of the Red Bull definitely took me by surprise like it might have others, and so ultimately ended up being a Max win, a Lando Norris P2, and an Oscar Piastri P3. So I do get a point for, no, I don't get a point. I get a point total. Obviously Max and Max takes the win, so no points for me there. A Lando Norris P2 is half point for finishing second, and an Oscar Piastri P3 also half point for getting that one in the wrong place as well. So a single point over the course of my predictions for the race podium. And then we'll wrap things up with my one crazy prediction. I predicted that Franco Colapinto would finish ahead of Pierre Gasly in the Grand Prix. This was another roller coaster of a prediction where after qualifying, I thought there was no way in heck that this one was going to come in, obviously with Colapinto crashing in qualifying. But at the same time, Pierre Gasly makes a mistake early in the Grand Prix, puts himself down the order, kind of in the hands of Colapinto, who actually led ahead of Gasly for a little bit, but ultimately he allowed Gasly through to try and challenge forward, and that one was kind of all she wrote. So while he did look pretty competitive in the grand scheme of things, at least compared to his teammate at certain points, he definitely has a long way to go. And I think this one might have just been a lucky come in rather than a true cooking like I thought it was going to be. So unfortunately for me, no points for me on that one. So that brings my total, if I check my notes here, I bring home 3 points, a solid weekend, but nothing to write home too much about. It was a very even weekend once again in the community. If we take a look at our points total after the race weekend is over, we now see Sentinel 40 sitting in the lead with 26.5 points. F1 Inferno now on 25 points. Me just a half point back from him, still in third and 24.5 points. British TTG on 22.5 points. Andrew 15.5 points, and Spectral unfortunately not getting their predictions in this weekend, still on 9 points. So still all to play for. It's going to take a good weekend and it's going to be a battle for the rest of the season. I don't think there's ever going to be a weekend where one person is just going to severely dominate and they'll really surge ahead. So this is going to be all about consistency. I'll be back stronger next week, I promise. But guys, that leaves only one question remaining. What is next in Formula One? It heads to the Principality. It is the Monaco Grand Prix weekend. I cannot wait. Monaco, the glitz and glamour surrounding it are obviously exciting. Qualifying might be the most exciting out of any on the calendar. Last year, obviously, most memorable result, maybe of last season, one of the most memorable results of last season. Charles Leclerc winning the Monaco Grand Prix last year with Oscar Piastri P2 and Carlos Sainz P3. The only question is, does Ferrari have what it takes to really challenge for a win in Monaco again? Or is it going to be a Max Verstappen or papaya-colored car leading the way? What do you guys think? Let me know down in the comment section below. But guys, there we have it. The Imola Grand Prix is over with. What did you think of the weekend? Leave your rating for the weekend down in the comment section below. I'd love to know what you guys think the weekend was from start to finish. We'll be back in another week for more predictions. If you are interested in joining our community predictions challenge, you can head to the link down below, join the Discord, and leading up to the Grand Prix weekend, I'll make the call for these exact same predictions that we answered here in this one, and it'll be a lot of fun. We'd love to have you join our little community. And speaking of joining our community, subscribe if you haven't already, and if you made it this far into the video, leave a like rating on the video as it really helps me out. But guys, that is going to wrap it up for me here in this one. We'll be back in just a short few days. It is already race week once again. I hope you're excited for it because I know I am, and I see you guys in the next one.